Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are dialing in from. A real pleasure to be having this conversation with you. This is the final episode of a fantastic webinar series we've been running on compensation intelligence. And today, I think we've got a really important conversation to have, particularly with the climate that we see externally. Only today we see again, Microsoft making some big layoffs, big signals of this type. It looks like a really tough and turbulent market for a lot of the businesses that we're in. So today's topic is compensation intelligence in the troubled world of work. How do we use compensation intelligence when we have to make the tough decisions out there? Not only recruiting the people we want, but sometimes we need to look at it the other way. How do we make contractions and changes that way? Let's do some introductions firstly. We're joined by a good friend of mine, Rachel Gibbs. Rachel, can you quickly introduce yourself? Who are you? What it is you do?
Hi, I'm a compensation and benefits specialist. I started my career in taxation in the UK and have done a number of freelance and interim reward contracts, now based in Switzerland.
Fantastic. And we're going to be joined, I believe, by Sarah Ali from Radency in a moment once we get the tech online. But we also have Virgile as well. Virgile, can you quickly introduce yourself? Who are you? What it is you do?
Of course I can. Like Rachel, I started my career in compensation and benefits a while ago, a long time ago. I won't mention how long ago. And then I did a few HR roles for a few years, for 10 years or so. Then I created Figures 2 years ago, October 2020, to help companies, and especially startup and scale up, set up their compensation policy with real-time, reliable real-time data when it comes to compensation. And Sarah is here.
Yeah, great. And there's Sarah. Sarah, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. I apologize for the technical difficulty. I'm using my iPhone right now to do this. My Mac has shut down, so it's okay. Nice to meet you all.
Okay, great. And Sarah, I know it's like super early for you in the morning, so I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. It was wonderful to see you earlier this week. Now, can you quickly introduce yourself, actually? Who are you? What it is you do? Quick.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. Global economist at Radency. Radency is an HR tech company. We work with Fortune 500s on aspects of the human capital lifecycle, specifically retention, recruiting, attrition, all that fun stuff. Nice to meet you all.
Fantastic stuff. Okay, let's get into the conversation, folks. I mean, in terms of, let's imagine the scenario is a startup scale up. We pull together a compensation plan. We talk about leveling. We do all of that stuff. Do we think about redundancies when we're constructing that plan, or is it always a case that is, it's not part of the plan? It's gone wrong, and we have to kind of hack away at the business that we've grown. Like, do we ever design for the idea, hey, we need to do it so that potentially we contract and expand? We can't always predict permanent growth. So I throw it open to anybody who's got any experience of this. What is how do we do this? Do we do design about redundancies? Do we think about it?
If I can jump in, I say that both it's finished as a former like the VP of People Operations, so like HR director for a startup, and now CEO. I think you never plan for that, right? You're designed to be hyper ambitious from the get-go and see how you're going to succeed and design ways to succeed. However, I think if we're being realistic, in the back of our mind, it's still an option, but it's not an option you're planned for very early on. Like, I don't say, I've never been part of discussion where like, okay, this is a plan for the next year or two. Let's design a scenario where we have to cut down staff in 9 months from now, right? You have to deal with that if you don't make it. But I think the whole DNA of startups and scale up is to plan for success, to plan to be very ambitious, like to shoot for the moon, even though you know that there may be 95% chance that you won't get there, but this is where you spend your time on. And in fact, investors themselves don't want you to spend too much time doing scenario planning in case things go wrong and so on. It's part of the DNA to be like, we want to be hyper ambitious, how we're going to get there. And if it doesn't work, we see what we do, right? But we plan for to be a unicorn in 5 years, and this is how we're going to get there, right? So I don't think it's part of DNA to plan for those things so far ahead.
I think that's absolutely true as well. I've never been part of a business where there has been an elegant redundancy, let's say, where there was a protocol. Oh, this is exactly how it works. It's always, oh, crap. And that's basically the starting point for thinking about it. So going to you, Rachel, maybe, because you've got like lots of enterprise corporate experience also on that side, as well as you, Sarah. I think you've worked for big organizations as well. Does any business or organization plan for, the negative? I mean, do we actually have that in place, and should we?
I've seen it in place a few times in the big corporates, usually where the unions have intervened at some point, and they've or the works councils, and they've agreed what would happen in the event of redundancy or trimming. So yes, it does happen. And also then the flip side, that they've had the policy in place for a number of years. They've realized how expensive it is, that they've shot for the moon and missed. And then I've seen them try and negotiate those packages down. That does happen, unfortunately, as well.
Yeah, so maybe a feature of maturation then. So a company that has got to enterprise scale, there's inevitably scenarios where they've had to contract over time. This might be a multi-decade, even a century-long type business. So over time, once they've gone through a few of these like traumatic issues, they end up developing a protocol and saying, you know what, this can happen, let's do it differently. And as you mentioned, the labor rights, and that's going to differ according to different jurisdictions. You're talking about worker councils and stuff. That seems to be like a very German type of thing. So you can imagine, certain countries or certain jurisdictions being particularly sensitive this way, other ones not so much so. How about you, Sarah? You got any comments to make on this, whether companies plan for this?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially right now. I mean, I'm an economist, obviously. So a lot of my clients are asking, what's the probability of recession? That's one issue. Okay, how does inflation impact all of us? Like through wages and just scenario planning. I feel like I don't like to use the word optimistic or pessimistic. I try to think about things in terms of levels of risk, right? Low, medium, high. But I think to Virgil's point, and apologies on the mispronunciation of your name, I think I joined a little late, but I agree with you. It's really important to have agility, flexibility, and thinking about everything in terms of like 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. But here's the problem. It just keeps changing. And so I think if you are, agile, whether you're a small organization or a large organization, it's to your benefit.
You know what? It is. I wonder how much of it is because we didn't have the intelligence before, because it was such hard work to actually know, what the benchmark was. It may have been a once a year type of exercise you perform, or you're waiting for some industry report to tell you. They're not going to give you real time data. They'll produce a report, and for the year, and that's the thing you lean on, and that's your plan for the next 12 months. And you can never be that agile because you don't have it to hand. Now, this is not a plug for a product like Figures, but presumably that gap is being filled, and suddenly we start having more real-time information as to what's happening in the market. We can expect, I guess, some more greater agility in terms of how businesses operate, and maybe some a little bit more planning as a result of that, in the sense that let's say you use external intelligence and internal intelligence. Externally, what's going on in the market? Are we going to be heading for contraction? Internally, meaning internally in industry, in terms of comp and bends, you can think, okay, at some point, if this tracks the way it's tracking, we might have to make a change, and you can start planning for it rather than hitting the wall and then trying to figure out once you've smashed in against it. So yeah, interesting. From your side, Visual, it'd be interesting to know whether any companies will end up doing that. It's very early on, obviously, in your journey as a product. But right now, I think the mindset has always been, how can we set the comp levels to be competitive to hire, to be a competitive and attractive brand. But I wonder whether you might start getting companies that say, hey, listen, we need to actually monitor, where we're at. How can we use this information to help us when times are not so great?
So I think it's interesting. Multiple points what you said. To your last point, we've always had companies who are very willing to benchmark themselves towards the lower end of the spectrum. Maybe they are not public about it internally, because it's always tough to be versus employees being like, we're targeting the 25th percentile. We have some clients, in fact, one that I talked to last Thursday was like publicly stating to the company, they're kind of specific because they have a very mission driven, and says, we can't compete with the larger scale startups. We target the 25th percentile. They're transparent about it, but that's a minority. I say most of them, at least they target the median, or they target something higher than that. So it'd be interesting to see, as you mentioned, so I noted down, to track how many companies will reduce their ambition in terms of market positioning moving forward to be something more conservative rather than targeting the 80th, 90th percentile. And to your second point, I agree with you. But of course, it was not the case when we created Figures. We are far from like 2 years ago from anticipating. I'd like to say that we anticipated a war in Europe, hyperinflation, and VC market layoffs and stuff like that, but we didn't. But yes, I think it makes more now than ever. You need to have data. It's impossible to know what's happening. Is inflation versus economic crisis versus layoff versus how is things shaping up into the labor market? I mean, no one knows until you have like figure on the pulse and you have like real-time data, I think.
Yeah, this is going to be it's going to be a benefit for everyone to have that information available. You mentioned actually about inflation. We probably jumped the gun by talking about redundancy straight away, but I remember when the cost of living crisis was becoming a peak earlier this year, there were some stories of employees trying to renegotiate their comp because of the cost of living crisis. In other words, hey, I've accepted this job on the basis of this. However, my mortgage rate has just gone up by, from 2% to 7%. Now suddenly the fixed outgoings are significantly higher. I need to comp back. Now in this situation, how is compensation intelligence going to be helpful? Do you think it's helpful for organizations, or might it in fact be damaging in some way, in the sense that employees might use that as leverage in some form? What are your thoughts on this? Again, open question to everyone.
So I think any knowledge and intelligence of what's going on in the marketplace is always helpful. You may not decide as a business to act on it, but once you've got the information, you're in a stronger position than you were before. And this question about changing your approach to where you are against the median is a long-term decision. It's not something you can change overnight. Both from employee perspective, but also from where you are and kind of your internal relativities rather than the external relativities. So for me, as a specialist, any information is always any reliable information that I can use is always welcome.
What would be the scenario where if you did have an employee coming back at you, should we say, and trying to renegotiate based on cost of living issues? Has anyone got any experience of this? Do you play it hardball to say, look, you sign the contract, and there's nothing we can do, or are there any compensation packages that do in fact feed in cost of living? I mean, I suppose that's going to be a little bit more radical, but I can't imagine it's actually there because it seems complicated to do. But I wonder whether that may eventually be, like, I wouldn't say an endpoint, but the next stage in the journey might actually be that. Like a comp package that's actually pegged to cost of living rather than just a fixed number, which is a bit crude. Sarah, you're kind of nodding away there. Any thoughts on this?
I had some ideas. I was thinking about this. I feel like it's going to vary by industry. For example, I used to work for the U.S. government. So every year, we had a COLA, cost of living adjustment to our salary. Obviously moving into private sector, compensation varied according to, your performance and the profits of the company. And then I think about other industries that I don't work with directly, but I have worked with in the past myself, teaching economics, like being in academics. I feel like it's very frustrating. I just can't imagine if you're a, assistant professor trying to get tenured and they just fix your salary. So I think, it's going to vary where we go. And that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, per industry different. I like the fact that the US Gov actually has that cost of living adjustment every year. That seems very progressive. I don't think that exists in the UK. And I'm pretty certain it doesn't exist in many private sector organizations, does it? You usually have a personal or individuated plan that's decoupled from what's happening externally, which is just that. But then you think how crazy inflation might get. We're talking, we're being alarmist in our sort of Western Europe in particular, with high rates of inflation, etc. But you look at Argentina and places like that have had like ridiculous spikes in comp. Like, how are those folks paid? I mean, surely there is adjustment, because you may be paid a certain salary 1 month, and that could be like a tenth of what it might be 2 weeks later. So how does comp work in that scenario? I don't know. Anybody? I mean, Gilles, I know your customer base is predominantly Europe right now, but have you witnessed any businesses attempting to factor in cost of living into their comp plan?
So first of all, it's the standard amongst larger companies for expatriates and assignments abroad, right? So part of their package is aligning differences in cost of living between two areas. So in most of those cases, when I was a while ago, when there was hyperinflation crisis in Argentina, when we had people over there, we had to impact their salary on a monthly basis to follow cost of living differences and stuff like that, right? So it's part for assignees and expatriates, it's a standard. For others, though, I mean, when you putting aside some very specific crazy phenomena like the Argentinian crisis of hyperinflation at the time, currently right now we run a survey on this, and we had like 30%, interesting, overall 30% of companies said they've taken action or plan to take action regarding inflation. When we looked at US companies only, it was 75% of them who said we are going to dedicate a specific budget towards inflation, general salary increase, and something like that. See, in the US, many more companies, at least in our survey, we surveyed 200 companies, said they were taking action. But some other ones, they would say, you know what? We have a process. We look at market data. If this market data moves, we're going to adjust our compensation policy. If not, we're not going to overreact to any cost of living changes, to any inflation, to anything like that. We stay true to our process. This is how we remain fair. Staying true to our process is how we remain fair, right? This was our viewpoint.
Yeah, and now that you mention it, I do recall in the UK there was like one-off stipends were being given to some companies were giving people. I forget who it was, Rachel. I know you're in Switzerland now, but I wonder whether you keep paying attention to the British news. But there was one company that was giving like £500 voucher or something for energy costs and stuff like this, which is obviously not a huge amount in the grand scheme of things, but it's some sort of indication that the employer is sensitive to cost of living and is factoring that in, because they know that obviously a lot of employees are going to feel very much under pressure, and the existing salary is not going to be sufficient to pay the bills. I myself had to react to this because I'm a limited company. Briefly is a limited company. Obviously, I pay myself absolutely nothing as a director, but I had to adjust my own pay because I couldn't afford to pay the bills. So I thought, right, I need to give myself something. So yeah, I think it does happen, but perhaps it's variable. It's per company. It's not something that is in any way universal. Certainly not automatic, right? So no one's actually plugged something into a system that would auto adjust a comp. Or at least signal the requirement to do so based on cost of living data or what have you. It would be quite cool to have at least a notification on that. I wonder whether in future you might have a system that has a dashboard that can flag up, okay, you got like 20% of your staff are currently on wages that they can't survive on, or something of this type. Because of this has happened externally, that I think is some information that maybe HR really needs to know, because HR might be in a different pay bracket. They may not feel it in the same way. So,
but like one point on that is, I think among the 200 companies we surveyed, some were taking action generally, and some were taking action saying, you know what, we want to stay true to our policy that we don't want to impact directly cost of living, and inflation doesn't have a direct impact on wages. We're going to have a look at cost of labor, so market standard and market rates. However, we feel that for the lowest salaries in our company, it's on our responsibility to do something to help them out, those in need. So they set a threshold, and below the threshold, they will either give an increase or either give a one-off bonus to help fight off inflation. Personally, that's the kind of strategy that I kind of like. Staying true to your process overall, while feeling some form of empathy for lowest paid employees and giving them a bonus.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
To add to that, with seeing other companies doing innovative or potentially innovative things like free lunches, the John Lewis Partnership in the UK have done that, and also looking at highlighting other benefits that are available, such as discounted offers at various supermarkets. So I think there is a few providers in the UK again who do that. So highlighting those to employees to try and make the money that they've got go a little bit further. There's few things going on.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
No worries. We look at data job applicants and we ask them questions about, what are the factors that you prioritize when you're applying for jobs? And it's interesting, the last past year, I was looking at the data year over year, things like getting ahead in my career, making social connections, that actually was higher prioritized than compensation. And I was, surprised to see that. That's kind of what we're trending here, at least on that side.
That I think is stated preferences, though. So I think whenever you ask people, very few people are able to accurately attribute their own true motivation. And not to deny that that's important, but it's a nice thing to say. Yeah, sure, it's about career, etc. But when push comes to shove, the comp tends to be the biggest thing. Like very, very few people, I would say, move to a less well compensated job. Unless there was another factor, a shift of career, relocation, something of this type. Even if you're not having a great time, you're going to hold out for something better. So it's interesting you say, I think they're in balance, but stated versus revealed is I think we need to be aware of. By the way, I just had a thought bubble, but I'll share with you right now. In the same way that COVID-19 had really put flexible working onto the mind space of job seekers, so that now every job seeker is thinking, right, I need to have flexible working in the package. I wonder whether the cost of living crisis today will in the next year or two also have a similar impact, where job seekers might think, what, I need to have some sort of way in which the comp can float with the cost of living. And what are you doing as an employer? What are you doing to help with that? Do you have a mechanism to sort this out? Because I'm accepting this salary at this number, but hey, we're about to go into crazy hyperinflation. What does that mean? You know what I'm saying? So I wonder whether this ends up being some sort of EB sort of thing at some point, where companies have to build in these factors. Interesting to know what your thoughts are, folks. I mean, people who are watching this, do let us know, whether your business has thought about this at all. Because I do think it's probably on the edge and marginal, but surely something that's going to become more prominent as time goes on.
Week, actually, labor market updates coming out, I believe. But I found some research from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. They actually found a direct correlation between housing prices and remote work. So a 1% increase in remote work actually causes a 0.9% increase in housing prices. I mean, that's really interesting.
Well, hang on. Are you saying if more people do remote, housing prices increase?
Mm-hmm, correct. Yeah. And the larger.
Isn't that counterintuitive? I would have thought that increase of remote means people go to Bahamas or whatever, and that will reduce the pressure in San Francisco or these metropolitan spaces, and it should decline. But you're saying no, that's not the case. At least in this local information
from the study, from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Yes.
No, it's interesting. I mean, that's another thing to think about, because let's say cost of employment increases. So all of this is increasing cost of employment, right? Cost of living increases. We need to retain staff. We need to do what we can. That ultimately increases the cost of employment for the business. Now, any business is going to think, okay, how do we manage that? Because if we can't grow as a business because it's too expensive to hire per person, we need to find another way. Maybe one of the ways is actually to start relocating the jobs into places where we don't have as expensive ways to hire. Now, what are our thoughts on this? This is using compensation intelligence, but it's kind of pushing towards outsourcing now, which a lot of people are offshoring, if you like, or at least distributing the work out. And some people might be uncomfortable with that. What are our thoughts on this?
I'm not so sure about offshoring. There's been a lot of indication that since the pandemic, the amount of investment into China has flatlined. There has been no further investment into China. And in that particular area, we're starting to see roles and jobs onshore again. So I'm not sure in terms of how you would deal with that with a comp. You're looking at market data and what's available in the market, in the work environment or remote environment that you're looking for your employees from, would determine that.
Go ahead, Vishal.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's a tricky topic, right? The topic of how much responsibility from company to start getting work or workers in lower cost of living areas, and then how is that their responsibility or not their responsibility? Is it just capitalism at its best and doing the best allocation of resources? I'm not sure. However, to the first point, what we've seen in our data is that the gap between, when we look just at France, because this was where we had the highest, the biggest historical data over the last 2 years. 2 years ago, the gap between Paris-based salaries and remote-based salaries were like around 10 to 11%, and this gap kept shrinking. But not because there's been a stagnation in Paris-based salaries and the remote salaries have been getting up, because both have been going up, but remote salaries at a much higher rate, which implies that employers are not cutting costs by using more remote workers at lower cost. It means there's more and more people from like Paris, or more and more people going to work remote and pumping the salaries up in those remote areas. So I don't see this as a way to, maybe a short-term way to save some costs, but more and more people, more and more skilled workers, when they go remote, they try to keep the same salary or maintain the same salary as much as possible, and they bring some of the salaries up in the areas they're getting to. We have anecdotal evidence that I've had Croatia, Romania, Poland, salaries have been skyrocketing with people going to work remotely over there, even Portugal to some extent. So I think the effect is inflation in salaries in pockets of places where there's talents willing to work at sometimes a lower rate than like Paris, Berlin, and London, but those salaries keep getting higher and higher.
There's probably two factors in tension, aren't they? And you're right about sort of the job distribution increasing the local wealth of the economy. It's actually a form of wealth distribution in the end of the day, which, you know, if we want a more equitable world, we should be happy with. Latin America is a good example where a lot of North American businesses are thinking the right time zone, great engineers, 1/4, 1/5 of the cost, and they're working as if they're in the same place. So let's just put our engineering team there, and that makes total sense. And you can imagine people might migrate down. Mexico, for instance, is starting to absorb a lot of US immigration, particularly people who are attracted to the weather, the cheaper cost, the standard of life, etc., but maintaining quite a high salary for what they would otherwise get. So there's that push and pull experience. I think two things I think is worth thinking about. A remote worker is suddenly in competition with everybody globally. So you're now as an employer competing with the highest payers in the world. So you can't necessarily be too harsh in reducing salary, particularly if the person's relocated out. But on the other hand, there may be people that have never worked in those super high rich sort of environments that would accept the lower salary, and that would be a downward pressure over time. And that will eventually equalize. So, you know, like for instance, if I was in San Francisco as an engineer earning 500 grand a year, I relocate to Sao Paulo. Yeah, maybe I take 350 or something. But eventually there's going to be some young kid in Sao Paulo that will take 150. And as a company, I'll be thinking, I'll get the young kid from Sao Paulo because that's a significant savings. So there'll be some equivalence at some point, but up or down, I think, is still heavily in tension. I'd love to see any recruiters do this, by the way. So are there any recruiters that have gone like remote or done anything like this and just relocated just for their own sort of experience and for their own well-being? And what are your sort of experiences as a candidate? It'd be quite interesting to do a dedicated show on that, because I think a lot of people are thinking about it. But what does it look like? What does it feel like? You know, not that many people that I know have actually gone and pulled the trigger. So it'll be interesting to see and find that out. Okay, folks, just draw your attention to a poll that we have set up at the bottom of the screen here. Take a look at that. Please do submit. Quick question is, has your company gone through redundancies 2022? Yes, no. Go ahead and make a vote, folks. Submit, and then you'll get a reveal. Okay, cool. So let's talk about redundancies. There has been no plan. We didn't design for it, but you know what? The boss has come to you and said, hey, we have to lose 20%. Now, how does compensation intelligence come into this decision-making process?
I think that, if I can throw my hat in there, I don't think, well, it might be true, but most of the time the redundancy decisions are not entirely made on comp. They're mostly org design type of decision. Sometimes the decision made on comp to close an entire office because it's been low performing business unit in like Germany or whatever it was, and it's costing too much. But it's more like not compensation, as this is like overall business structure and business revenue that may decide to close a branch, to close an office, something like that. Then the decision on individual departures are often not made on comp. However, comp becomes a huge factor for how do we retain those that remain. But maybe we want to deal with that later on. But I haven't been part of redundancy discussion where we're being like, okay, we're hesitating between a few people here and there. We're going to have a look at the package to determine who we want to let go or something like that. It's mostly org design rather than compensation in my experience.
I think this is a very, very interesting insight. So what you're saying, Virgile, is ultimately where the financial cost cutting is the primary driver to decision making. It's at the unit level, business function. So you might say, you know what, recruitment marketing is not working. Boom, it's gone. Or London's not doing okay. Sorry guys, you got to go. But it's not at the individual level where you say, you know what, you're too expensive, out. That tends not to happen, although at least it's not explicitly the thing. I mean, there's another thing that's also the case. There may be some implicit sort of decision-making and factors going in where you can imagine a scenario to say, you know what, he ain't so good, but at least he's cheap. Let's keep hung around. He's okay for what we're paying him. It's okay. Whereas this guy here, he's too expensive. We can save a lot by just getting rid of Virgile, let's say. We're going to lose talent. That's a blow. But actually, he's worth 2 of Hung. So, let's see you later. So I don't know. I mean, I've never been in that situation myself because my experience has always been small business. So I throw it over to Rachel and Sarah, actually, just as individuals within a bigger organization. How have you read or felt redundancies happen or work, and how much do you think the compensation has been a factor in all of that?
So I've sometimes seen cases where people are on probation and it's not a nice decision, but very often because they are cheaper to let go, unfortunately they've been the first, and sometimes there's been the first in first out approach as well. It's not a great thing, but that does happen. So okay,
I think that's actually quite logical, isn't it? So if the person's in probation, there's simply less overhead, less administrative overhead. That in itself is a cost. And that is a way to it's a cost-driven exercise to a large degree, maybe a cultural one as well, because the person's not so far embedded in, so the cultural cost is less. But it's still a plus minus calculus on that. Off you go. How about you, Sarah? Any things to share about sort of how the cost comes into decisions to make redundancies?
Organizations, it's been made at the higher level, the macro level, right? Looking at efficiencies and process improvements, and is geography X, right, doing better than geography Y, things like that. But then to Rachel's point, if somebody, for example, is on a performance improvement plan, it's a little easier to justify, the compensation cut. I guess it just kind of varies.
Yeah, I read an article the other day. I forget who it was by, but the idea of being on a PIP is like not a great position to be in. I think it might have just been some advice on Hacker News or something. And the advice was, okay, if you are in a PIP right now, you're done. You're out. It's just the method of getting you away. What you should do is do bare minimum and simply look at other things, activate to the market. Now, Virgile, you're shaking your head. Probably go ahead.
Yeah, as a past HR, it's an unsolvable problem, right? Because I think there's part of the organization. I think there's two ways to look at it. Part of the organization is like a PIP is just a way to document the termination process. And in fact, yes, if you're into this, maybe this is a good advice. But there's a part of the company, and I used to be part of a company that deeply believed that the PIP was really a way back to standard performance. But as the PIP itself had so much bad press, right? People were like, "Oh, you're putting me on a PIP. I know. I'm gonna do the bare minimum. Start looking for work." Like, no. I swear, we are hoping you get payback performance. I've been there. I know you can't say you just want to terminate me. Wink, wink. I know you want to put me back on good performance track. Okay. And it's self-fulfilling prophecy. So it became to the point where you put someone on PIPs, they were like, okay, I understand that you're going to terminate me. And then you're like, okay, what can we do then to start putting people back on a good performance track? So it was a real pain point of mine, this topic, because of that. Because you feel like you just can't win. You just can't win.
It has got itself into a, maybe because of misuse, right? Because performance improvement plan explicitly is there to help the person improve. That's what it states to be there for. But of course, it's also used to get rid of people as a formal, journey out. It's the. I mean, I think PIPs probably exist in environments where there's more worker protection, let's say, and you need to document how it works, etc., etc. I wonder whether this type of thing exists so much in an at-will type of environment. Hopefully, Sarah can come back and comment on that, where you can just simply say to people, hey, listen, you're gone, and the person's gone. Maybe that's simply more honest, rather than, go through the ritual, and now basically I'm sure there were genuine performance improvement plans, but they've acted instead like a trigger to leave because the person's, has received it as, I'm already out. Therefore, any effort is wasted. I might as well focus externally and look for other things.
We have at will.
It almost seems sorry.
Sorry, Sarah.
No, this will be fast. It almost seems like a PIP. It seems like a PIP is like an explicit signal. Like I think about this maybe hung in economics, where it's like you weed out people based on efficiencies. There's equity, there's efficiency. How do we balance that? I mean, that's something we're constantly thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. As Rachel about to say something, I think.
No, it's just Sarah's point and about the explicit messaging, and the alternative to a PIP is mentoring, and that's a very different message. That's, we're investing in you, we want you to do well, whereas the PIP is quite explicit. So you can do the same thing in two different ways.
I wonder whether the PIP can ever be recovered. It would be an interesting conversation to have, to say, look, has anybody ever turned this around as a branded sort of
Yes,
thing?
I think it's a branding exercise now. It's like those kind of failed companies that you need to rebrand the product, start from scratch, and it's like, I'm going to put you in an objectives attainment acceleration program, whatever you want to call it. It's like not a PIP at all. It's completely different, and maybe that's rework. I think the whole thing is killed. The whole brand and image is killed now.
Yeah, I think so. Sometimes it's gone too far and you can't recover it. So, like I said, I've never been on a PIP. I've never been in an organization that even had those things. So I don't know, but I would probably react badly if I was placed in there. It's almost like you're in a remedial class. In fact, I have been in a remedial class when I was a small child. I was in the slow learners group. So I do understand how that feels. It's an outrage. I felt completely outraged. How dare you put me in with the slow learners? Do you not know who I am? That kind of attitude. And anyway, but it worked. It got me out of there. So I don't know. So yeah, maybe the humiliation of it. Perhaps we bring back humiliation into the work culture. Could be something that helps improve performance. Who knows? Okay, let's move on and talk about sort of where we do need to make like really aggressive cuts, and not only letting people go, but potentially renegotiating downwards the comp that they've had. Now, that's happened in many companies I've been in, particularly in recruiting. Not unusual to say, hey, folks, everyone's going down to this number this month because we ain't making the payroll otherwise. We're trying to save jobs. That's the mantra, right? Hey, listen, I remember actually being in one company where they said, look, we either lose 10% of us here or we all collectively agree to take a haircut. What are you going to do? And most of us took a haircut, right? Apart from one or two, which said, yeah, I'm all right, Jack. Some of these guys got to go. So, but anyway, how does compensation intelligence help us with making those types of decisions? Is that too broad a question? Probably is. So let's say we need to make cuts, right? So we're not making the numbers that we need to make. We're in desperate straits, but we also don't want to make redundancies. How can we use compensation intelligence to help us make the right decisions going forward? Where is that valuable for us as a manager or a person trying to determine what to do?
I think I'll just start. These are my 2 cents. I feel like I'm just thinking about this from a legal perspective. Like, hey, I signed up for this job. This is my salary. Then the boss comes back. Hey, this company's doing bad. You need to take a 20,000 cut. That wouldn't sit well with me. That's me as the worker. But I think in terms of the company and the management perspective, if it's like a mid to large size, I mean, I don't think they necessarily go for explicit salary cuts, maybe looking at other non-monetary benefits, cutting those out, right? Like, I don't know if it was one of the big tech companies, where it's like not everybody gets a free bean bag for today. We're going to take out these bean bags, right, from the budget, things like that. I mean, that's where I would start.
Yeah, the basically the common goods go, right. So no more free lunches, folks. Sorry, the gym membership's cancelled. The masseuse that we had on payroll, that's not happening. That kind of thing. Rather than the real cut into the person's paycheck, which is really tough. But yeah, it has happened. I mean, definitely I've had it. So what about your thoughts, Rachel? I mean, does compensation help? The compensation intelligence help us in some way? Like, for instance, we know we're in the top 10 percentile of our industry market, let's say. And we think, okay, we've actually hit some problems. Actually, we can lower us a little bit because we've already been well compensated. That's using compensation intelligence. I mean, has that occurred, and is that a good idea?
I've never seen it occur in practice. In theory, definitely it could. It would even give you an opportunity to address some of your discrepancies in terms of gender and other equal pay issues. It would be a difficult sell in terms of managing expectations across the whole organization. But if you say we've got limited budgets, there's no alternative, we have to take this, or the business fails, there might be some more openness to it. The other thing that you could do as well is look at not necessarily increasing salaries, but offering greater holiday or sabbaticals. I've seen in the past where people are given a 6-month break to take the cost off, see where things are improved over the 6 months. People go traveling, they get something out of it, and the business buys a bit of time. That's another alternative. But certainly compensation intelligence to help you manage any reductions would really underpin that well.
Go ahead, Virgile.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, going back to some of the cutting down, like the bin bags of free lunches and so on, is like, when you look at most businesses, right? Most businesses, the cost comes down to people, right? When I have a look at the CEO myself, you said there's like a 10K per month cost for someone to have us someone. Like, I can cut down a lot of things. I can remove the Kinder Pinguis or the bananas from the break room if I want. At the end of the day, you know what?
Trivial.
It's peanuts compared to just one person. It's really nothing. However, I think there's a kind of, which is interesting there, is like the kind of image and perception of those moves, right? It can backfire if you're like, okay, you're terminating people, but you're leaving snacks in the kitchen and stuff like that. It can backfire in terms of image, but when for most tech businesses where the 70-75% of the cost are people, most of the real cuts you can make to business still remain cutting down on people. But if you want to manage kind of the image of your moves well, you have to do some of those moves, I think, for it to be perceived well. But at the end of the day, it's really ridiculous compared to just one salary or one person's salary or multiple person's salary.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of good points there. The kind of the optics, I think they call it now, right, is important. And that's, but at the same time, you're also degrading the experience of people that are there, and that's actually one of the important things you've got to try and do. Because if you're trying to make redundancies, you shrink down 20%. You don't want to accidentally lose another 10%. Because you've compromised the work experience for everyone else. So it's a difficult balance to make, isn't it? And we'll talk about that in the next couple of minutes, but I want to just touch on a few points before we get there. None of us are lawyers here, but I just wondered, like, what would be the legal scenario if we took a vote on whether we went down the redundancy route and lost some heads, or we all collectively took a pay cut? What would be the scenario if we didn't get a unanimity in that decision? There was one person, two people say, you know what, nah, sorry, I'm sticking with my salary. I've got family to take care of, like legit reasons why they want to stay with that. Like, does the thing fall apart? Does it have to be unanimous, or can we do so? Like, what is the situation there? It seems to me we can't force them away from their contract, right? So yeah. I've maybe answered my own question there. Interesting.
I think that's right. So, if you have a situation where two people decide not to go ahead, you cannot force the change onto them without agreeing a new contract. And you also have to protect them. You cannot shame them as the two who didn't do it. I think you've got those elements to consider. So it's tricky, but ultimately it's their choice, and you have to respect that as an employer.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm just trying to work out how it worked out in my old circumstance, because that was a situation that happened. I definitely took a pay cut, but there was definitely people that refused. So I had no idea what occurred there. Okay, I like the idea of downshifting or the reducing time, right? So that could be one way where we can maintain people on staff, even maintain them in the business in some way, keep the institutional knowledge, not lose all of that. But simply reduce their time and say, look, listen, we're going to take you down to 2 days, pro-rata that down in some way, make sure that's okay. But then, they've got extra time to do what they need to do. Maybe that's something, again, that could be useful and valuable for at least provision of an option for those people. And again, maybe you connect that down to, this voluntary pay cut. It's in exchange for something else that they get. Okay, let's talk about the retention side, because one of the responsibilities of management when we're making cuts and things are difficult is also to make sure that the staff that we do have are still motivated and ready to go. And let's not forget, when companies are contracting and times are tough, it actually can be a very demoralizing experience, and it can very easily slide away. Attrition is one of those things that can be a runaway problem. One person leaves, makes it easier for the next person to go, and if the third person goes, suddenly there's a little bit of a momentum there, and you've lost control of your business. So how can we use compensation intelligence effectively to retain staff under these tough conditions?
I think it's I was hinting at that earlier, but it might seem counterintuitive to most people, I'd say, but any redundancy plan needs to come with like a retention plan that often is tied to compensation for remaining people, right? Because you'd rather, and I think in the discussion I've had with some of our clients who are going through this, who have gone through this in the past, I think even investors know this is between a plan where you're like letting go of 20% of your staff, but have like no budget to do salary increases next year, and a plan where you have to let go of 25 or 30% of your staff, but you have ample budget to retain those who remain. Now people will choose option B. Well, it might seem counterintuitive to the whole population. And I think in the past, it wasn't so clear to me, but now most people have gotten that the blueprint is having some budget left to remotivate people, for salary increases, and therefore this is putting a lot of pressure into, okay, we're gonna have a budget allocated for retention, how best to use it? Right, and I think that's for sure it's the motto and the plan for companies going through this type of events right now.
Yeah, so go ahead, Rachel.
Thank you. And to add to your point, I think as well, very often, if there isn't budget left over, sometimes there's like a contraction of people's salary, inflation eats away, and then the economy picks up and new recruits come in, and this is where you need compensation intelligence, because you need to make sure that everybody's on the right level, and those who've stayed and kind of seen through the difficult times.
Okay, we've lost you a little bit there, Rachel, but I think we've got the gist of what you were saying, and it's very much underlining Virgil's point, which was you can't absolutely cut that fine, because if you do, you leave no space to retain staff. And on an extension, when you're hiring new people coming in, you might end up with a big gap between what you're paying currently and what the new market, what the new entrants are looking for. And then you go back, you basically de-leveled your organization by doing that. So you've got to have, I guess, the maturity to say, you know what, we might need to make a slightly deeper cut than you might think is obvious at this point. But in order to give us a buffer so that we can regrow, sort of when times improve. Sarah, you were nodding your head there. You got anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually have worked on retention incentives for some clients in the government, back in the day in security and defense. And so from my experience, do like flatline retention incentive, we use targeted incentives, right? because it really does vary on the position you're looking at, the compensation that they're currently making at, right? What are the factors that are motivating that individual, right, to stay or to leave or to exit? So I think that's interesting. And then, one more point I'll make is I was looking at data actually here from the US, the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. They collect data on different cohorts in terms of their median, wage growth. And it's showing still that job switchers are making more than job stayers. So it's really fascinating, right? Like what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think we've known that for a long time, isn't it? It's simply because the open market competition is going to just inflate those salaries, and also the psychology of the job seeker is different. If you're working in a business, presumably you're happy, you got a lot of business as usual going on. Very few people are like always thinking about, what's the number? Most of the time you just get on with it until maybe it's an annual thing, or maybe biannually even it would be the max. I would say most people think this way. But if you're on the open market, that's the predominant thing in your mind. You're thinking, right, this is a time to step it up and negotiate the right thing. So negotiation mentality then inflates that number. So yeah, I think so. I mean, we all want to retain staff, and we all want to be positive that way. But there's no question that some sort of plan to cycle out on and back to different companies, in and out to companies, if you like, is the right approach if you want to optimize your salary growth. Okay, folks, I want to end with a slightly controversial note, but it's important to think about. And Rachel, you actually introduced the idea where we had salary discrepancies, compensation discrepancies, et cetera, based on failure to level properly, or even discriminatory practices, if not principles. How do we use compensation intelligence to help us level that? And is that itself an ethical and right thing to do? So in absolutely crude terms, and speaking very plainly, you might have a bunch of people that have been overpaid based on their ability to negotiate pre-leveling, but now you've got to make cuts. Is it now the case, an opportunity to say, right, all of those folks that are now aberrations away from the leveling, do we get rid? Everyone who's outside of the level, here's a great opportunity, boom, they're gone. And then you start again with a nice clean slate. Do we do that? It seems to me that we should, from a logical point of view, but is that ethical? Is that right? What are your thoughts?
It's interesting. So I'll jump on it quickly before. I think there's two things. Like, of course, legal obligations might differ, right? And I think in France, once you go into laying off multiple people, you can't go and select people based on. You can't go and do that kind of stuff, right? However, I think it's interesting the way you framed it, like cleaning up aberration from the past. Right? I'm being very crude as well, right? Because you opened the bridge, right?
Yeah, we've crossed that bridge, bro.
Yeah. I think with compensation, the tricky thing is that once you've made that mistake, you can't go around being like, "Yep, I offered you 80K. My bad. So starting next month, you're going to be paid 65 because I realized you over-negotiated and you're a fraud. So no harm in cutting down 15K of your salary, right?" So I love the way that's one of the only way to clean up. So when you have mistakes on the downside, right, you can always increase someone. But when you made mistakes of overcompensating people, you can't do that. And they're always the people that's going to create people like issues within your organization, because everyone will look up to that person being at that as an aberration. And when you have 10% in the team, one who's clearly overpaid, you have 9 people unhappy. So one way to do that, and I like the way you approached it. And the second thing is, I've never thought about what Rachel just mentioned earlier on, using those kind of period as an opportunity to improve on the gender pay gap situation potentially. And one way to improve, because often, and multiple studies have proven this, people who have over-negotiated and turned up to be overpaid are often men. So I wonder if there's a link there that's interesting in a way to use that as an opportunity to create a healthier organization from a compensation perspective. So I don't know how feasible it is even legally, but I very much like the idea to entertain the feasibility.
It's not straightforward legally, and it's not straightforward ethically as well, because I'm sure there's a bunch of blokes watching this and thinking, hang on, I've performed well in my business. We were in a different regime. I negotiated fair salary based on back then. That was how compensation was arranged. Why am I now losing my job? So it's not straightforward. It reminds me a little bit of how IBM, they had a big issue, didn't they? Where they very explicitly wanted to get rid of the dinosaurs, quote unquote, which were exactly these overpaid people that have been there a long time, that simply accrued this type of salary and this type of level. And they used kind of like mechanisms that do mass layoffs. In other words, re-leveling is one of the techniques I think they tried to say, okay, this person doesn't fit into that space anymore. And you can imagine, a company in a similar scenario where they're making redundancies would use similar techniques. But in fact, IBM, I think, lost a case there because a lot of the people who were made redundant actually said, look, you discriminated me against the age, and also on gender, older men, basically. So how do we do this? Rachel, any thoughts on this hot potato before we conclude the conversation?
So the British Broadcasting Service did it with some of their really high-paid male presenters, and it caused a lot of noise, and it was detrimental overall to the BBC. But they did achieve it. The only way I've seen it done is when you have a level of transparency around the salary ranges within a role, and you say to the person, you're at 100% or you're at the one extreme in this range, and we're going to slow down the acceleration of your increases. In fact, for the next few years, until the range catches up with you, you're not going to see an increase. It's not popular, but that level of transparency helps that discussion.
Yeah, very interesting. Sarah, last word to you. Any thoughts on this difficult topic, using compensation intelligence to create a more equitable environment, but using the lever of redundancies to do that?
Yeah, honestly, in my own experience, I'm just thinking about it. I feel like with compensation, it's just 100% always inherently ambiguous, right? There's never any equity. But like in the US, for example, with respect to public sector positions, those salaries are actually open. I mean, you can Google search any federal government employee and you'll see their salary. Private sector, you have no idea what they're making, right? Unless you're going to Glassdoor, Indeed, LinkedIn, so forth, and checking that out. But I don't know. I think the point that I like that Rachel brought up was thinking about this now in terms of the pay gap, right, between men and women, but not just that, marginalized groups, right? Whites versus Asians, Hispanics, Blacks, African Americans, especially in the US, they're always traditionally underpaid. So yeah, it'd be a great conversation there. And legally, I don't know what to say. I'm not a lawyer, so I will not comment.
No, I think it's interesting. It's tough, and it's like I say, the topic of the title is compensation intelligence in a troubled world of work. And we as people, we can't just embrace the world of work when it's happy times and it's like, yeah, we're growing, we're just recruiting away, yeah, it's all brilliant, let's do amazing culture. Sometimes businesses get really tough, and businesses are organizations that need profit, they need revenue, they need those decisions to be made. And actually, that's where our biggest responsibilities are. That's when we come into the fore. So we can't shy away from this topic. No one else is going to take it on with any kind of joy, but it's a big part of our professional sort of makeup. So do make a use of all of the resources that you have, including the people that have watched the show, people who are on the panel, the technologies that are available. I'd recommend everybody do what you can to just keep the conversation going and make sure you're not trying to solve these problems by yourself. Anyway, that's about it for this webinar. Also, that's it for our series. So wonderful to be part of it. I hope you've enjoyed it. All of the episodes we've done so far are available on recording. So I believe everyone who's registered to this webinar will get an email with all of those things available. Do keep them and review. I'm sure you'll find them useful. Let me take the time to thank everyone for watching and thank our wonderful guests. Dr. Sarah Ali, thank you so much for your contribution. Rachel Gibbs, great to see you again. Thank you for your contribution. And Virgile, listen, man, we have to find some other time, find some other way to get back on screen. It's been a pleasure sharing the screen and these conversations with you, man.
Likewise, Hank. It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot, Rachel and Sarah, for being part of the last episode of our series. And have a great day, everyone.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.